Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the week 6 video for survey of American and British literature. In this video, I would like to first discuss the discussion questions and give my particular take on these questions for Kew Gardens by Virginia Woolf. And then in the second half of the video, I'd just like to briefly introduce you to this week's work, which will be Araby by James Joyce. And I'll just briefly explain some context around that and offer you the discussion questions there. All right. As I mentioned last week, Kew Gardens, I think, is a major kind of development compared to the other stories that we look at. If you go all the way back to Defoe's story, The Apparition of Mrs. Veal, then we jump ahead 150, 160 years to Oscar Wilde's The Model Millionaire. It's a much shorter jump, but there is a bit of a difference in the storytelling and obviously the story here in Kew Gardens. So I'd just like to go through some possible answers for the discussion questions that were offered last week, and hopefully kind of, again, open some doors and windows or look at some other perspectives perhaps you hadn't considered about this story. All right. Again, this is not the law on this story. These are, I think, maybe some traditional ways to view this story or analyze it, or some well-recognized ways to view this story. But again, for this course, what I'm really interested in is your engagement and really just trying to help you get into these stories so that you can find ways to build a relationship with them and begin to feel more comfortable with your ability to analyze literature. So again, consider that all answers are, welcome and possible and could be helpful to us, but there are better answers than other answers, and those better answers are the ones that we can explain more clearly, ones that we can tie to the text, to the context, to the history, to the culture, to make a more understandable, reasonable answer for how we read these different stories. Okay? So I gave you a lot of kind of background information on modernism and its techniques, and some of the specifically the technique of stream of consciousness, of which Virginia Woolf is quite famous for. So that, I think, you can really start to see kind of the difference between the first two stories we read and this one. This story is really quite a departure from the other two, which are fairly traditionally structured in terms of kind of a linear, straightforward plot and characterization. This story is much different from that. And that's why I included the comparison question in the discussion questions for this week or last week. All right. So anyway, the modernist aspects, they might be confusing for you. But again, this is what the artists were dealing with. All right. So it's helpful to be aware of what the artists' mission was, what their project was in trying to reimagine literature during this modernist time. So that's why I wanted to give you those notes. But don't let that be the only way for you to interpret and understand and enjoy these stories. Okay, but hopefully that can shed some light on it, and hopefully in my discussion today and answering these questions, maybe I can deal with some of those aspects of modernism in these answers. All right, so let's talk about that with question one. All right, I think that is an excellent place to begin. All right, at the beginning. Uh, for each of these stories, I've always asked you, just as a simple exercise, summarize the story in your words in English. And I think that for this story, Kew Gardens, might be the easiest question you've had so far in these discussion questions. All right? What happens in this story? Not a lot. All right? I could quite basically say, it's a hot July afternoon in Kew Gardens in London, and four groups of people walk by a flower bed in which a snail is slowly making its way through the dirt. That's it. That's the plot of this story. All right. So it's fairly simple in that way. All right. And I think that really kind of highlights what is changing in literature. And we'll talk about that more as we go. But if you want a little bit more plot summary here, as I said, it is a hot July day in Kew Gardens in the middle of London, and there is an oval-shaped flower bed and a path that runs along next to it. First, a young family walks by, and the father's thinking about a girl who rejected him, while the mother's thinking about a delightful afternoon she spent painting in a garden, and an old woman kissed her on the head. Next, we get a description of a snail making his way through the flower bed. Then we get two more men on the flower path, human beings. One seems to be old and senile, right? Kind of losing his mind. And the other one seems to be a younger man who is very patient and caring for him. And the old man really brings up the war, all right? World War I think we can assume, given the publication date of this story. I'll talk about that more in the future. And then just behind them, we get another group. We have two elderly women from the lower middle class. One is stout and ponderous. Okay, she's a little bit chubby and a thinker. And the other one is rosy-cheeked and nimble. Okay, kind of her opposite in a way. And they seem to be kind of watching the senile old man and questioning his eccentricities. And they seem to be talking about their present lives, relationships they have, maybe a meeting they might be having, and some of the groceries they may need to buy for this meeting. We don't really know. We can't really tell by their dialogue. But they're just kind of wrapped up in the hustle and bustle of their present lives. And then finally, we get the fourth group, which is a young couple, all right? Described as, the kind of butterfly that has just come out of the cocoon. It's just become an adult, and its wings are drying. It's at that point in its life, about to fly and take off. So we have a young couple in love, and they are kind of on a date, and they take a parasol and they poke the tip deep into the earth, and the man discusses where to have tea, and the woman considers about how she wants to explore the garden more. And after that, boom, we get zoomed out, and the story ends with a last paragraph kind of giving us the big picture of here we are in Kew Gardens on a flower bed, or on a path next to a flower bed, but we're surrounded by this loud, noisy city, London. All right, so that is your plot summary. Again, you can make that very simple, though. All right, so What about the plot then? I tried to draw your attention to, like, this is probably the simplest question I've asked so far. Why is the plot so simple? All right. Um, well, again, it kind of reflects the experimental nature of the story here. So let's move on to discussion question 2. Why is the story called Kew Gardens? What is important about the setting? All right. Now, simply put, because the plot is so straightforward and simple, the author here, Virginia Woolf, um, really is putting an emphasis on the setting. Okay, and this is more of an experimental story. The story is moving away from the kind of traditional mode of, a linear plot. Actions happen, conflicts exist, and then we have characters who play them out. Right? In this story, I think we can say reasonably that plot and character are not as important. They are not emphasized by the author like the setting and the descriptions that the author offers us here. All right. So the simplicity of the plot places emphasis on what is here, what is included. There's not a lot of plot. There's not a lot of characterization, right? And that is a very good note to remember when you're analyzing literature, because the author, in this case Virginia Woolf, has to make choices on what she is going to focus on, and therefore what you, the reader, are going to read. So you are not reading a complex plot with really deep characterization. You have these elaborate, eloquent descriptions of a place, and then these stream of consciousness dialogues and thoughts from these characters that we know very little about. And that is her choice, right? So that really should kind of bring attention to something like the setting, right? So Virginia Woolf, could have titled this story anything, but she has chosen the setting of the story to be the title. So she is, in a way, emphasizing the setting rather than any kind of event or any kind of character, right? So it gives the setting a higher importance, right? And in this experimental story, that is important, all right? It is emphasis. So the story is called Kew Gardens to emphasize the setting, because the setting is so important here, all right? And why? Let's get a little bit more into what the setting is, okay, and why it's important. Kew Gardens is the Royal Botanical Garden in London. It's a real place. It's right in the middle of the city, busy city. It is a hot day in July, and the story specifically takes place, right? It's a large park or large garden, but it only takes place, you have an oval-shaped flower bed where the snail is, and then this path that runs along next to it through the garden. And in all of Kew Gardens, it just takes place in this little area, all right? We can safely assume that it's the afternoon. We know it's July. We know it's hot. We can safely assume it's the afternoon because of the weather, and that's when most people will probably be strolling and taking their tea. All right. And we can probably safely assume that this is kind of the contemporary present. All right. The story is published in 1919. And I think we can safely assume that the year of this story is 1918, 1919. Okay, because the old man does mention the war, and it's published at this time. So I think we can assume that is around this time as well. All right. So what's important about this setting? Well, that really kind of depends on what's important to you, right? As I said earlier, it does give emphasis to setting rather than plot or character. And here, that setting is important because it provides a place. All right. It it the plot of it, like I said, is just a group of four groups of people who walk by this flower bed, and these four groups of people just kind of talk about random things in a way, but it provides a kind of place. Okay, the setting provides a place for a snapshot, okay, a snapshot of society. All right, these different groups of people. So we get, in a way, to we get a cross section of society. We see society in these four small groups kind of represented. All right, and we learn about their emotional state of mind, and how they're reacting to their current situations, with the modernist implications as well. So again, that's the setting provides this place where we can kind of objectively witness these different groups of people from one society. Although they have various places in society, right? Their ages, their class, their sex, all these different aspects of what they're thinking about too. All right, and this setting provides a place just to witness this as a reader. So again, there are these differences that are brought up by the groups, and having again just this simple setting, right? It's almost like a stage in many ways, and that really allows us to pay attention to some of the differences here. And I think difference is important to understanding this story. Think about all the differences there are in this story. As I said, when we talk about the groups, we have the differences in age and sex and relationships and class, even body types as well. But there are many other aspects to consider, and I think a lot of the theme focuses around what is real. All right, but consider here the differences between permanence and disappearance. All right, we get the young man thinking about tea and how real the coin feels when he rubs it in his pocket. We get the idea of the appearing and disappearing. Right, the first young family, they seem to disappear into the woods when they move past the flower bed. All right, you get a lot of the descriptions about what's real or what's appearing and disappearing in this story as well, and that the description must be meaningful in how much it's emphasized as well. We also get kind of the differences between having an aim or having a direction or a goal and being aimlessness, right? The snail has a goal or a direction, but other things seem to be quite aimless as well. All right, consider that, especially in the different groups of people, right? And as I said, the differences between real and unreal. Okay, like I said, with the appearing and disappearing, but even on another aspect, consider the setting itself. It is a garden, right? Kew Gardens. But when we think about gardens and plants and nature, we think it is natural. However, Kew Gardens is completely man-made. So it's somewhat paradoxical to label it natural when it is in many ways unnatural. It is created by man in this case. All right, but we also then again have the difference between a natural space and then the city that surrounds it, London. All right, and we get the differences of society, of the people and the groups of people and their relationships compared to nature, which are the insects, the snails, the dragonflies, the butterflies, the singularly high-stepping angular green insect as well. All right, so there's a lot of this kind of duality, if you want, that runs through. There are differences that are exposed in this story and emphasized. All right, even in terms of perspective, the large and the small. Right, the snail seems to be walking through the garden, the flower bed, just as these humans are walking through the garden. So we have the tiny and then the slightly larger. But then even when you get to the end of the story, we have, this whole setting, this tiny setting of a pathway in Kew Gardens is a very tiny part of a much larger place, which is the city of London itself as well. So these kind of differences in perspectives really comes into place. And that all comes because Virginia Woolf is placing so much importance on perspective, on place, where we are, the setting. Okay? So if you ask me, I would say that's why the importance of the setting that's why Kew Gardens is important in its setting. All right, number 3, if we move on, what is an important description for you in this story? As I mentioned earlier, because plot and character are not that important, they're not emphasized in the story, that means setting is much more important, and setting needs description. And I think a lot of you probably noticed just the difference in the level of description here that comes in the story, and that might be something you compare to the stories we read before. All right, so what is an important description for you? Well, there are so many different descriptions, and I can't tell you which one is important for you, but I'm curious about which ones you chose, so I'll be looking for that in your discussion. For me, I could choose many descriptions here to really consider, but I think to really continue the discussion we've been having, what I've talked about so far, to try and help give you a more coherent reading of this story, I will focus on the last paragraph. Okay, as a conclusion, I think that was the most meaningful description, because here it really unifies what we've witnessed in her story. It takes the simplicity of each individual episode, of all the different couples, the young family, the older senile gentleman with his younger patient friend, the 2 elderly lower middle class women, and the young couple. All right, the last paragraph kind of unifies these different episodes. Like when we read these different episodes, they seem just kind of random, right? And they are. But I think the last paragraph really helps to unify it. This description is a kind of conclusion for the story that helps me really, out of all the other descriptions, to understand this story. So, as I said, it takes the simplicity of each individual episode of all the couples, and it weaves it into a more complex but coherent picture. Through her description, her imagery, all right, and description is so heavily reliant on imagery, so pay attention to that. Woolf really expands our consciousness and really challenges us to understand, or try to understand, we may fail, the complexity of life. Okay, like I said, this story it has these different groups of people, and they are like a cross-section of society, right? Which explains the whole wide breadth of, kind of everybody living in the society to a certain degree. So it is complicated, but it also involves nature and all the various aspects of nature as well. So I think this last paragraph really kind of brings it together. It weaves these random things together with her description and her imagery. And it challenges us to understand the complexity of life, time, relationships, the stories we tell ourselves, the romantic ideals that we have, the goals that we work hard to try and achieve, like the snail trying to make it through the garden. Okay, in a way, I think this story is, as I said, in a way, mocking us, the reader, people, okay, individuals, human beings. It's mocking our being so simple, right? If we just think about our singular lives, our relationships, the things that happen to us just on an everyday, and how important they seem to us. I think when we read this last paragraph, the amount of perspective she brings us in zooming out from this small garden and reminding us that we are tiny parts of a larger society, a larger world. Okay, then it really helps to understand that we are just surrounded by chaos. And as much as we like to think that the world is logical, rational, reasonable, right? I have reactions to my experiences in the world, and I take actions to try and achieve things, to do things in life. Okay, like have tea, or decide to go over the leaf or under the leaf if I'm a snail. All these decisions, they really kind of seem so meaningless on this large scale. And the last paragraph just kind of describes this tiny little setting in Kew Gardens and how kind of insignificant it seems to the larger, hustling, bustling, loud city. All right. It kind of reminds us we're surrounded by chaos, even though we try to make our lives seem logical and coherent. So this last paragraph, I think, for me, provides that perspective. It allows me to understand these simple little things that happened, meaningless things in this story. All right, and I think if you don't quite understand that, maybe my next reading will provide a little bit more perspective as well. It says, identify an important symbol and explain what it means to you. All right, if you go back to week 1 when I briefly discussed imagery and symbolism and their relationship, right? Remember, imagery is basically description, and there is a lot of description in this story. Right? So description is trying to recreate some sense of reality, some sense of human experience, right? Sight, sound, taste, touch, temperature, all of the sensible aspects of how we as humans experience the world. But imagery, because of the word choices the author has to make, often really opens up the door to symbolism and how we can find objects or actions that have another layer of meaning. Okay, this, all right, might be an object in the story, but it has a deeper representative meaning. It is symbolic. So let's talk about possible important symbols. And with so much description and so much imagery, I think that there are so many things that you can possibly discuss as symbols. All right. For example, the garden itself, Kew Gardens, might be symbolic. The flower bed might be symbolic. The flowers and the petals and their colors might be symbolic. The silver shoe buckle that the married man talks about. The dragonfly, the butterflies, tea time, the heat, the parasol being pressed deep into the earth. All of these things might be read symbolically. It really depends on how you read it. All right. I could go on. There's so many things that could be symbolic in this text, and I think that's part of the modernist aspects that we find in the story, and Virginia Woolf's eloquent description and imagery as well. So what would I like to focus on? How about our little brown snail? Our hero, perhaps? If this story has a hero, maybe it will be this little brown snail. So I think the snail, just like I described in the question number 3 about an important description, I think the snail is helpful to the story, just like that final paragraph is helpful to the story. All right? Why? Well, I said the final paragraph kind of brings a sort of unity and coherence to understanding the random events that we witness in the story. I think the snail really helps us with that perspective as well. So it kind of goes hand in hand with unifying the story and understanding its perspective. Specifically here, the snail, I think, helps to better understand the characters, or how to understand the characters. All right. When we look at the snail, right, as a symbol, literally as an object, it's just a little brown, snotty snail. Okay. However, literally, it's trying to make its way through the garden bed. That's its story. All right. Our hero's journey. A little brown snail trying to walk through a flower bed. Okay. But I think if you consider one aspect, right, how much emphasis does Virginia Woolf give to this little brown snail? Well, I think he or she, I think they're hermaphrodites. He, she, the snail, it gets a lot of importance. I think there are more words about this character, if we want to consider the snail a character, than any other character. And we come back to it twice as well, at least twice. Okay, so consider just how much time, how much space, how many words Virginia Woolf gives to our little snail hero. That, to me, gives it a certain level of importance. And if we also think about it symbolically, here's how I read it. Okay, 1, he is covered in flower petals. That's how it is described. And I think, to me, that kind of shows how it is influenced or altered or intertwined with the flower bed. And in this case, the flower bed represents society at large, right? Just like you and I, we're influenced by our surroundings, our environment. This snail is influenced by its environment as well. It's kind of covered by these different colored flower petals. So I would say the snail kind of represents the individual, and the flower bed here is representing society. All right, and we can see the influence of the environment, all right, society as well, on the individual. Okay, number 2, we can also, just to further this idea, we can see how the snail must interact with others. Okay, we have a description of the singular, high-stepping, angular green insect, right? So the snail is trying to walk or crawl, slide, whatever verb you want, through this garden. But then we get this other insect that kind of cuts in front of it, all right? It alters its experience, its environment as well. So I think that kind of reflects how we also have to deal with the decisions of others, okay, in our environment. So there are other people who have other goals, other directions, other motivations, and their living can influence the decisions that we make and how we interact with our environment as well. Okay, and Another aspect to consider on top of the influence of the environment, the flower petals, the influence of other people, other insects. Uh, Three, we also learn that the snail has a goal, it has an aim, it has a direction. All right, that's something that Virginia Woolf includes. It's just talking about his goal is to make it through the flower bed, but there are objects in the way. So there's a kind of conflict here. And the snail, all right, is kind of anthropomorphized. It's given human qualities to a certain degree, I think we can say, in how it's trying to think, if snails really think, about how to, get under the leaf, go over the leaf, go around the leaf, right? That is a very simple thing, but it is something the snail is thinking about as well. So it's a reaction to the environment, all right? So it has an aim, it has a purpose, just like we as an individual in society. We try to give our lives aim and purpose. All right, so what's going on here is we can kind of connect the snail to the different characters in their experiences along the path. Well, the snail is having similar experiences in the flower bed. All right. So, maybe our reaction as a reader here might be to ridicule this. So it's just a stupid little snail. Who cares? All right. Or we may not pay attention to it because it's just a tiny snail. Again, who cares? All right. It's insignificant. Who cares where it's going? It's not going anywhere quickly, right? Why choose a snail? It's one of the slowest organisms on the planet, right? That's what it's famous for, being slow and stupid and insignificant, right? But our author has chosen to focus on this tiny creature and its very insignificant but purposeful goal, right? So there must be some meaning, right? We can reasonably say there must be some meaning to infer from all the attention this snail is getting. And I think this snail symbolizes us, symbolizes each individual person, but on a smaller, insignificant, unimportant way. All right? So this snail is a symbol of how insignificant and unimportant we are, our lives are, as tiny individuals in a much larger world. So this snail gives us that symbolic perspective. Okay, the snail represents us. And again, the point here is to put it side by side, right? It's in the flower bed, a smaller version of a garden, trying to walk through or crawl through. What happens right next to it? Slightly larger perspective, the human perspective, one that we are probably more willing to pay attention to because it's human. We get these four groups of human beings with emotions and experiences and memories and actions and reactions. And we'll probably pay more attention to them because they're human. But Virginia Woolf is making us pay attention to this tiny insignificant snail also. Right? So to me, that is what is symbolic here. And that's also, to tie it back to what I mentioned earlier about the important description, that's why that last paragraph is so important, because it really puts into perspective, because Virginia Woolf zooms out from Kew Gardens, our setting, to the much larger setting of London. Busy, loud, noisy, chaotic London. It gives us another perspective to see. And then everything that's going on with these four groups of people now seems insignificant, just like the tiny snail slowly moving through the flower bed is insignificant. So it again shows us how insignificant we are as individuals, how purposeless our existence can be in this modernist society as well. So that snail gives us a kind of perspective. The snail represents us, and we learn that at the end of the story when the setting zooms out and we see how small and insignificant we are. All right. Okay, that's my reading. Feel free to agree or disagree to that. Number 5. What do the different groups of characters add to the story? All right. Well, I could go into great detail and try to read meaning into the various things that they do and they discuss and their relationships. All right. I could spend another 4 hours probably talking about them individually, but I just want to be brief here in this video and discuss them as a whole. All right. As I've mentioned a few times, I think they are representative of society as a whole. They present a kind of brief cross section of different aspects of society. Right. That's why they are various in their ages, in their relationships, in their classes. All right, we learn about the different class that they're in, their sexes, male and female. Right, we have a family group. We have 2 men. We have 2 women. We have a young man and woman. All right, so there's a mixture of sex as well. And what do these groups do? They provide a broad perspective of society. So this is a small slice of a larger society. So, I mean, if you want to, we could say these 4 groups of people are symbolic of the larger society as a whole. Okay? And through these different groups, right, what importance do they give to the story? It shows just how individuals within a larger society, with their various backgrounds and feelings and emotions and relationships, how they all can be reacting at the same time, at the same place. All right, the setting of Kew Gardens as well. So here it just, I think that's what the overall kind of use of these 4 groups of people does. Right now, obviously, I'm being very brief here because each of these groups do have their own issues to discuss. Right, they do introduce other themes or ideas that might interest us. Right, like the man talking about being rejected by another woman before he married his wife, or how she is focused on, painting pictures and being kissed on the back of the head by an older woman. Or I think especially how the older man talks about the war and what the implications are there. We could get deeply into that. And the modern age versus the romantic age, right? That's also part of the setting here too, right? This is 1919 when this is originally published again in 1921, but written in 1919 and originally published, which is the end of World War I. And the World War I really plays a large role on the influence of modernism, the whole period. Right? We talked about modernism. It's a very, very complicated subject, but basically it is a deliberate and radical break from traditional understandings and expressions of art and culture. Okay, because before the modernist period, before World War I in Western society, we had very classical, traditional societies. But after that, and with the increase of modernization and all these other aspects, it left people feeling really empty. Things had truly, deeply changed. All right? So that's being introduced here as well. And how society is adjusting to this shift, right? And that's again, they're starting to question what is real, what are the importance of meaning and reality as well. Okay, so a lot of these things are introduced by these different groups, but again, overall, if we want to study, if we just want to focus on the importance of what these groups do, I would say simply they just add a cross section of society that we can use, we can witness to what's happening at this place, at this time, this setting. All right. And that brings us to the last question, number 6. Compare Kew Gardens to the other stories. All right. Again, I think this is very helpful for this story in particular because it is so different, I think, from the more traditional and linear and plot and character driven stories that we find in The Apparition of Mrs. Veal and The Model Millionaire. I think in discussing the first 5 questions, I've mentioned many of the differences already. So I think I can just kind of review some of the other aspects here. But I think first and foremost, we should say that this story is really just an example of a modernist literature, the literature of its time. Or even in modernism, there's kind of high modernism, the peak of modernist times, and people generally say the year 1922-23 is the peak of modernist literature. And this is published in 1919 and republished again in 1921. So this is really at the peak of modernist times. And if we compare these stories to the other ones, this is really an example of it. And Virginia Woolf herself is one of the most widely and highly regarded modernist writers as well. So, and if we look at what's incorporated in this story, all right, it is quite experimental, right? Why is that important? Because, like I said, modernism is a deliberate and extreme or radical break from traditional storytelling. So this story does not rely on plot or characterization. It's experimental. It's moving away from the traditional way to tell a story. All right, that is one of the big differences to the other 2 stories, and that's important in how this is exemplary. It's an example of modernist literature. Here, it also relies heavily on description, which the other 2 stories don't so much. And that description really opens up imagery. And modernism is also a time where imagery was very important. There's the imagists, you might see in Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot. And images and imagery was very influential among modernist writers as well. And we can see that in Virginia Woolf's take. And then also we can see, because as I mentioned, imagery really opens the door to symbolism and representation. This, I think we can see a lot more of compared to the other stories, right? So I think the attempts at interpreting the story, finding meaning in the story, I think it might be more difficult if you compare this story to the other 2 that we read. It might be more difficult to find meaning because in The Apparition of Mrs. Veal, it's a very straightforward. The narrator tells us what the story is about. And in The Model Millionaire, whether we can trust the tone of the narrator or not, the subject of the story is fairly straightforward as well. All right, and the themes of the story are fairly straightforward. But in this story, I would say they are not straightforward. We have to really try hard as a reader to find meaning. But it's really that effort that we have to make that opens up the possibility of more meanings. And the question of reality as well is much deeper compared to the other stories. So we really need to pay attention to our reactions as readers. So I think that pulls us into our minds. It forces us to be more aware of our consciousness. We have to pay attention to what the writer is doing, because the writer is not telling us so much as showing us what is happening in this story. So again, you can see that reflected in the technique, the writing styles of modernist literature, of Virginia Woolf specifically too. And this modernist period is also defined by being a period of realism. All right. Realism has many various and sometimes complicated definitions in literature, but it is basically what it sounds like. It's trying to make literature more real. It's trying to show human experience more naturally, as it is. Okay? It's think about it this way. Compare the dialogues that you find in the first two stories, The Apparition of Miss Veal, and the dialogue that you might find in The Model Millionaire. That is more kind of dramatic, artistic dialogue. If you think about it really, it's probably not how normal people talk to each other. All right? But in the modernist period and in this period, you find the dialogue, it is more how people actually talk. Okay? In story one and story two, kind of generally what people, the dialogue are, grammatically complete sentences. Where in the dialogue here, it's just kind of random, fragmented speech, right? There's a lot of jump, 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 half words, things like that. It's much more kind of incoherent, right? The dialogue doesn't have the perfect grammar, and they don't make perfect sense to tell the story, all right? Like they do in The Apparition of Miss Veal and The Model Millionaire. So that is kind of representative of realism, of human experience. Think about it whenever you're just having a conversation with your friends. How much of the language we communicate in any language is based on context, how much they understand of what's already happening. Okay, we don't tell, necessarily from the beginning, middle, and end of a story if the friend we're talking to already knows what we're talking about. Or if we discuss ideas that come out of our consciousness, they don't come out perfectly in perfect grammar, not usually. All right. So we kind of work our way through our ideas, through our consciousness, through our experience in a very incoherent way, a kind of a dirty way, right? It's not a simple way. It's complicated. And that's what you're seeing in this story too. And that realism, to use a technique here, it's exemplified by the stream of consciousness. Just as I'm here talking to you and the words and sentences and ideas are flowing to my mind, Virginia Woolf is trying to represent this aspect, this real aspect of human existence in the way she writes. Okay, she's trying to recreate that human experience of streaming consciousness to create a more real understanding of her story. All right. So that is kind of how this is an example of modernist literature, and that is in many ways how it differs from the other two stories we've read as well. All right, I hope this again helps you in some ways to try and understand this author, this period of writing, and this story, and maybe can deepen your engagement and understanding of this work and literature as a whole. Right? Remember, whenever we do this, it's really an exercise and it does take practice, and that practice is discussion and thinking and critical thinking and trying to reasonably explain what it is that you, or how it is you interpret a story. And we are going to continue that discussion with our next story. All right, so part 2 of this lecture, I just want to briefly, because the time is getting late already, discuss our next story. And that story is Araby by James Joyce, written in 1914, published in the same year, in the short story cycle Dubliners. Okay, so this is one story, Araby, which comes from a collection or a cycle of short stories, and that collection is called Dubliners, right, by James Joyce. All right, personally, James Joyce is one of my favorite authors. That's pretty typical response from an English major like myself. All right, I might seem boring. That might seem like a boring answer, but I don't care, because every time I pick up James Joyce and read him again and again, I am always kind of amazed by his talent. All right, even in this story, I picked up, and on the first page, just one throwaway sentence. And yet her name was like a summons to all my foolish blood. When I read lines like that, I'm like, it makes me smile. I appreciate the beauty of it. But that is subjective. A lot of people appreciate the beauty of Virginia Woolf. I more prefer James Joyce. He's always been one of my favorites. I don't know why. But he is highly regarded as one of the best English authors of all time. All right, he comes up a lot in that discussion. Now, some of you might say, who cares? Not important. I understand that. That's perfectly reasonable and logical as well. But just so you know, within the study of literature, James Joyce is often regarded as one of the best, and one of the best, especially for the modernist era. All right, he is famous for these writings, Dubliners, but his most famous, most appreciated book is probably Ulysses, which is a really long novel. But actually, that story, Ulysses, began as a short story in Dubliners, just the same as Araby as well. All right. And some of the things that are notable about Dubliners you can find in this story, Araby. And Araby is often considered one of his best short stories. For me, my favorite short story by him is The Dead, the last story in Dubliners. But that's too long, so I didn't want to include that in this class. But Araby is widely regarded by many to be one of his finer short stories. And it's much shorter and easier for us to digest in this class. And in Dubliners, things that you might see among all the short stories, okay, all the short stories are kind of related, all right? That's why it's a short story cycle. It's called Dubliners because the whole short story cycle takes place in the city of Dublin. And there are many themes that are repeated, okay? And you will see them in Araby as well, but you will see those in other stories of this cycle, okay? And Dubliners as well kind of has a progression. It's stories. They're all different short stories, but they kind of start with childhood, and then adolescent, and then adulthood. And when we read Araby, we will recognize that this story is dealing with adolescence, okay? Kind of in between childhood and adulthood. That's the narrative story is an adolescent, kind of a teenager, young teenager. All right, but some things to look for that you can find in Dubliners and you can find in this story are the concept of epiphany. All right, it's a kind of technique that many of the modernists use to conclude or resolve a short story. especially James Joyce, right? Epiphany is a sudden realization or an understanding, okay? And that you will notice at the end of our short story, Araby, as well. Um, you will find in Dubliners roundabout journeys. Okay, heroes or characters, the protagonists of stories have roundabout journeys. They start somewhere, they journey, and they end up in the same place. All right, it's almost a cruel irony. You can see that in other stories, Eveline in Dubliners, and you can find that in this story as well. It does kind of have a roundabout journey from where it begins, from one dead end to another dead end. All right, and it ends, like I said, with that epiphany. All right, so this is Araby. I hope you enjoy it. Again, James Joyce, I think one of my, he is one of my personal favorite authors, and one that is highly respected among English literature, especially among modernist writers. So it might be good to compare James Joyce with Virginia Woolf because they're writing in the same time and using many of the same philosophies or techniques for literature, for writing stories. So they might be good to compare to each other, but also keep in mind the other stories we've read when you're considering this story and analyzing it. All right, so I've also included discussion questions for Araby. We will follow the same process that we have been following, so make sure you post any two answers or more to these discussion questions in the Kakao chat room before Wednesday, 13 October. All right, and as always, I'll try to respond to you as much as I can. I'm finding this semester to be very busy, but I will do my best to try and respond to you. If I don't respond to you, it's not because I don't like you, it's just because I'm busy. But I guarantee you I have read all of your answers. All right, and I will do my best to try and get back to you as soon as possible. All right, anyway, the discussion questions to consider for this week, and again, any discussion question you want to add to our discussion is always welcome too. I strongly encourage that because the purpose of this class is really to get you to engage with the literature. That's the only way you're going to analyze it and get better at analyzing literature. All right, the question number one is the same as always. Briefly summarize the short story in your own words in English. Question two, describe the setting and its importance at the beginning of the story. All right, how is this story introduced? All right, it is a blind street, kind of a dead end street. Okay, it's it's not two ways. You go down it, and then it's at the end, and you have to go back the same way you came to leave that street. It's a blind street. But James Joyce uses that kind of in a metaphorical way also. All right, number three. Okay, what is Araby? Literally, okay, when the characters talk about Araby, what is it? And also, what does Araby as a concept, as a thing, what does it represent symbolically in this story to the narrator and to you, the reader, obviously? Question four, how is religion, in this case Catholicism, represented in this story? All right, it's unavoidable, the religion in this story. There's just too much of it to say it's nothing. All right, maybe it means nothing to you, but it's definitely there. So how will you, as a reader, deal with this inclusion of religion and Catholicism? Number five, what has the narrator learned or realized at the end of the story? Okay, remember I talked about epiphany. Okay, what is the narrator's epiphany, the sudden realization? Why is he a creature driven and derided by vanity? That's a quote from the story, how the narrator describes himself. Why is he angry and anguished? Also, why doesn't the narrator buy anything for the girl? All right, and the last question of these discussion questions, number 6, if this is not a simple love story, then what is it about? What are the themes of the story? What does it mean to you? Does this whole plot of the story, does it represent something else? I look forward, as always, to hearing your reactions to the story. So please populate the Kakao chat room once again this week with your wonderfully in-depth answers and responses. Thank you, and good luck.